Before we get started with the discussion, I just want to give you a brief overview of the Healthy Sport Index. You can see some slides on the screens as we go along, or you can also pull out your phone. You can log on to it at healthysportindex.com. So what is the Healthy Sport Index? Well, until now, there's not been a one-stop resource that assesses the relative benefits and risks of participating in sports. We know that parents and children want this information, and we feel like we owe them this resource so they can provide the best informed decisions for parents in order to develop healthy kids throughout their life. So the Healthy Sport Index combines the best available data and expert analysis to assess the relative benefits and risks of the 10 most popular high school boys sports and the 10 most popular high school girls sports. HSS partnered with us on it, and a really smart group of medical experts served as our advisory group guiding the project. We know that different sports offer different benefits and different children have different needs. So at the very top of the website, we say find the best sport for you. We want to customize the results based on each person's individual priorities and health criteria. So we asked the question, what matters most to you? And we evaluated 3 areas of physical activity in high school sports. One is physical activity. I should say 3 areas of health. One is physical activity. For physical activity, we looked at how much of the body's moving at high school practices. And this came from the new data from Michael Canners and North Carolina State. We also looked at safety. How common, how prevalent are injuries in high school sports, in each of the sports. And for this, we used a lot of new and existing data from the University of Colorado. And third, we looked at psychosocial benefits. This looks at how a social, academic, and emotional behavior of athletes been impacted depending on the sport. And this came from a new Aspen Institute survey in conjunction with University of Texas professor Matt Bowers looking at psychosocial benefits, and it also was in conjunction with some new data from the Women's Sports Foundation. We know that when you slide down on the website, you end up having results. We ended up evaluating the 3 categories equally across the board, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And when you scroll down, you end up seeing these initial results. For boys, it's cross country was at the top. For girls, it was swimming. Now, it's very important to note that the Healthy Sport Index is not intended to conclude you should play this sport, you should not play that sport. We believe all sports have benefits. If a sport finishes a little bit lower on the results, that doesn't mean that the sport is detrimental. It just means that in some particular sets of data, there are some healthier sports based on what we evaluated. But as we discussed, we also know that there's different criteria that parents may prioritize. So you can take this tool and you can slide it a little bit, and you can adjust based on whatever matters most to you. So for instance, if you have a child who is obese, you may value physical activity more and slide that more towards high emphasis. If you have a child who perhaps has had multiple concussions, maybe you value safety a little bit more. And if you have a child who perhaps is lonely, you might prioritize psychosocial benefits more. We weighted it equally, 1/3 across the board, but when you weight it, your own results pop up and you're able to see that. So in this particular example, I put 63% for psychosocial benefits, and now you see your results. So instead of previously cross country at the top for boys, now it's soccer at the top for boys. For girls, instead of swimming, now it's basketball. Healthy Sport Index is also about understanding the characteristics and the data of these sports as well. So each sport has its own sport profile page. You get to learn about the particular data, physical activity, safety, and psychosocial for each of those sports. You learn about complementary sports. These are recommendations that were made by national sport organizations, by some prominent athletes, by medical experts, based on 2 key areas. One are complementary sports to play to improve your overall health and fitness, and the other one is complementary sports to improve your athletic skills in your primary sport. And we also have best practices, and these are just 5 tips on how to make your sport be active and safer, and include some resource links. Finally, there's a key findings page. These shows sort of the 10 most interesting results that came from the Healthy Sport Index. One of them being that we found really early ages of sports specialization. For a lot of boys and a lot of girls' sports, the average age, based on a survey we took of high school athletes, was about 10 years old. And that gets into the conversation we're going to have here today, in part about sports sampling. So let's move over to the conversation. And first, just as a reminder, you can join the conversation on Twitter at @AspenInstSports and use the hashtag ProjectPlay. And we'll also get into some questions as well from the audience. You can submit Q&A questions at slido.com, enter hashtag ProjectPlay, and select the 7th floor to submit questions you have. Thank you all for being here. Let's start just talking about the practical use of Healthy Sport Index. Who do we think should be using this, and how should they be using it? Want to start with you, Laura?
Sure, thank you. So first of all, very excited to see a year and a half of work come to fruition. So thanks to everybody that's been involved. Primarily, the tool was designed for, obviously, parents, children, and anybody that's working with them to be involved in sports. As it evolved, however, it really is a tool that can be used for anyone, whether it's coaches, school teachers, athletic trainers, et cetera. If you look at the information and the way it's presented, it's general enough that the tips and the information could be very useful to any group. And I think that was part of the strategy, is because if we're going to raise the bar in this whole area, we have to reach all the stakeholders. However, parents and children should find this as a tool that could be very helpful to them.
Assuming I'm next, yeah?
Yeah, Mike, please.
Don't want to assume. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here. This was an exciting project for us and my research team at NC State to be a part of. We were really fortunate to be able to collect some really interesting and powerful data on the physical activity side. Completely agree with what Laura just said in terms of users. One thing I would add is I think it creates a great opportunity for parents and their children to talk together about what they want out of sport and what sports might help them achieve that. So often, we as parents tend to make the initial decisions as to which sports our kids are going to go into. I was a hockey player and a swimmer, so no big surprise that all 4 of my children went into either hockey or swimming. Now, as they grew in their sports, they sampled other sports and moved into other things. But I think the tool has a great opportunity to be a conversation starter between parents and their children about what do you want out of this? You know, what do I want out of this? And then having some information that can help guide that process.
Michelle?
Yeah, once again, thank you so much for coming and for your interest in the Healthy Sport Index. This was a fabulous project to be part of. I guess I come at that from 2 different angles in terms of the intended audience. One would be, although this is about high school sports, the feedback that I'm getting so far has actually been most robust and enthusiastic from parents of younger kids. And I think as parents become more discerning consumers of athletic teams and experiences for their children, that this will kind of help to drive that conversation in terms of not just what sport did the parent do, but what sport is really best for that particular kid. Kind of the second audience conversation that I have every day in my audience is I've got a lot of injured athletes who, for one reason or another, can't go back to their chosen sport, right? Concussion kind of drives a lot of that, but knee injuries maybe take people out of running-based sports. And so this is a fabulous tool to kind of get away from that injury and performance focus and really kind of expand, what does sport mean to you? What does sport give to you? How does sport enhance your life beyond the purely physical aspect of it? So I think it really expands that conversation.
Laura, hospitals benefit from people being sick and hurt. So why would HSS invest in a tool that is all about prevention?
Great question. Thank you. So, Tom started by saying Project Play was about youth, sports, and health. And so for us, health obviously is a primary focus. Very little people know that our history of the hospital over 150 years ago actually started to keep children healthy and out of harm's way during the Civil War. It's always been part of our mission. So I would say number one, first and foremost, it's always been part of our mission. Number two, athletes will always get injured. So there will always be the need to take somebody who wants to go back on the field and get back in the game and play. But I think most of all, it's really our mission. If we don't invest in children, and we heard a lot today about the culture, to keep them healthy, keep them informed, keep their parents informed, it's the basic mission of who we are as it relates to musculoskeletal injuries. So for us, this is a natural, as we are not only a hospital, but we're a health system that does a lot of community education, physician education, et cetera. So it's part of who we are.
Michelle, you were on the advisory group that helped put all these findings together. How much should people trust these findings?
Without reservation. The information sources are from all over the spectrum. So this wasn't really driven by an agenda per se. The injury data, for instance, so High School Rio, the big injury data website started by Don Comstock, that's been around for a very long time and has really evolved to be a very, very accurate resource. The psychosocial information was based upon validated survey sets. Michael Cantor's physical activity data, once again, readily validated. And this is the first time this has all been kind of brought together in one place. And hopefully there will be additional reiterations as this evolves. It's going to continue to improve. But without a doubt, the data that is there now is highly reliable.
And I can tell you that the Aspen Institute, HSS, the whole advisory group put a lot of thought and great care into making sure we have the best available data, making sure there was smart dialogue, expert analysis throughout this, and making sure that we have sound methodology. And we're transparent on the whole website, about what data we used and how the methodology was applied. So encourage you all to look at that as well. Michael, you had this great set of really rich data that is new in many ways with physical activity research. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how you went about collecting this data at practices and what the goal was.
Absolutely. Just want to affirm one thing John just said, that the advisory board in Aspen was very invested in the methodology that went into development of this. And I joked about it after at one of our initial meetings. I was presenting the methodology for collecting the physical activity data. And when I was done, I felt like I'd gone through my whole PhD dissertation proposal all over again. They put me through the ringer, but justifiably so. So really excited about the data that we were able to collect with this. It is somewhat unique in terms of how we've looked at sport. I've done physical activity measurements in a lot of different settings. A number of years ago, did a study with USA Hockey. I saw Ken Martell here just earlier, where we used this methodology to compare their new ADM model, American Development Model, with traditional approaches to running practices. And we were able to find that we got a very rich perspective on the physical activity that was actually occurring during sport practices. There's a lot of different ways to go about measuring it, but we settled on an approach called systematic observation, which is really, for basic terms, it's you go out and watch practices. You train observers and you have them go to the practices and you have them record how active the participants are during practice. You're not relying on somebody telling you, oh yeah, I was really active, or the coach saying, oh yeah, I keep my kids moving all the time. We stayed away from the coaches and away from the participants and observed and then recorded those down. Now you say, well, how can you come to some conclusions on that? Well, after watching over 600 practices and almost 700 hours of practice, we feel pretty confident that the measures in the end are very accurate in terms of how active the participants are during the practice. The other piece that we did that I think is critically important in evaluating physical activity in a setting like sports is to understand what's going on at the time. So when they're being active, what kinds of things were they doing? So we observed also context variables, like were they engaged in game simulation? Were they doing some kind of knowledge transfer where you're teaching them about a particular sports skill or demonstrating a skill? Were they doing management activities? Okay, I want all of you guys here, you need to stand over and get in line here, and you people, okay, you're going to start over there. So you're taking time in practice to do those things. So we measured all of those at the same time that we're measuring the activity levels. So it gives us the opportunity on the back end in analyzing the data to say, okay, here's what seems to be generating more physical activity, or here's some areas where there's a lot of sitting and standing around going on. How can we maybe improve practices to minimize that standing around time?
And one of the key findings that was really interesting that we made as a key finding was that boys had greater physical activity than girls.
Right.
Did anything in your research suggest why that is?
Yeah. So to me, there's two real key findings to come out of this. One, 60% of the time in the observations that we made over those 700 hours, 60% of the time the participants were engaging in either moderate or vigorous physical activity. So, you know, remember the CDC and a number of other organizations are pushing, they want our kids to have so much moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. Well, 60% of the time the athletes were getting it during practice. So you might think, well, that's good. And 43% of that time they're doing vigorous activity. All right, that's a good finding. But on the flip side, 40% of the time they're being sedentary. That's maybe not so great. That's maybe not the best use of the time from a physical activity standpoint. Now, keep in mind that sport practices are designed to do a lot of things. One is to create athletes and have them be fit, but as we've heard earlier today, coaches and the athletes want to win games, right, and win competitions. And that's done not just with the fittest athletes. In a number of sports that requires strategy and simulations and positioning and a host of other things that may not be inclined to produce vigorous physical activity. The other key finding John was talking about is that boys tended to be more active during practices than girls. So we started looking at the context variables to see if we could understand what was going on there. And one finding came out was that on the girls' side, there tended to be more time spent in management activities, getting them in position or knowledge transfer than there were in boys' sports. And the one sport that really highlighted this was track and field. There was quite a significant difference in the amount of time that was engaged in those management activities. Now, you can draw your own conclusions as to what's going on there, right? But it's something that's worth noting and worth looking at, and those are modifiable factors. So, you know, the new coaching tool that's coming out, you know, is talking about one of the things that we want our coaches to do is, and Kobe said it earlier, learn, be prepared. I remember when I went in to coach my first hockey practice. I thought I'd played hockey all my life. I knew how to play the game. Went in there and had, you know, 18 6- and 7-year-olds, and it was chaos. I mean, they had helmets on and sticks in their hands. What do you think they're going to be doing? So I went home and studied my butt off, and the next time I came back, I was ready. But that first practice was a train wreck. So by learning and planning for the practices, we can modify some of those variables.
We talked about earlier that the website has a key findings page, 10 really interesting results at healthysportindex.com that came out of our research. For each of you, and we'll start first with Laura, what was one maybe really interesting finding that was new to you or maybe just reinforced something that you previously thought?
So I think the psychosocial finding related to what other values kids get out of playing, whether it's with teams or even individual sports. And I think the surprising one is when we looked at football. We all know football results in physical challenges. But from a psychosocial point of view, football was very high in terms of the values that kids get out of playing with teams and learning how to get along with each other. And I think that was surprising. We didn't expect that. So I think the exciting thing about all the psychosocial data was that we're not only looking at the physical activity and what happens, but what are we learning about the psychological benefits of playing in sports, which, as we heard from Kobe and several people this morning, is very critical to children in becoming adults and responsible adults.
Michelle, was there a key finding for you?
Yeah, I think some of it actually came from Michael's work, that I think a lot of us, or a lot of parents anyway, they kind of lump sport and exercise and physical activity into kind of one bucket, yeah? So we signed him up for soccer, ergo he's going to get his 1 hour moderate to vigorous physical activity per day, and that's not necessarily the case. And so it really kind of emphasized to me that sport and exercise are really two very different constructs with very different impacts on young athletes, and you really have to kind of make sure you're taking care of both, because they're not necessarily going to happen simultaneously.
It needs to be intentional.
Yeah, intentional, yeah.
Michael, was there a key finding for you?
There's a number of them. One that kind of surprised me when we were looking at, again, the physical activity data was where cheerleading came out. I'd always assumed that cheerleading as a sport was a very active sport, and I think it is. But in watching the practices, it was one of the most sedentary sports. And again, watching through it, there's a lot of time spent teaching the particular skills and movements and everything else, and not as much time in the actual activity part of it. So that was interesting.
Yeah. Another finding also is that in many sports that we talked about, kids were specializing at younger ages. The average age was 10 in multiple of these sports that we surveyed of high school athletes, when they started playing their primary sport, focusing just on that sport. Laura, how does this knowledge shape our understanding of the challenge that we have to try to increase multi-sport play?
Yeah, definitely. It gives us a very, very strong message that we need to be educating parents, children, and coaches about the opportunities and benefits of playing many sports and not just specialization. I'll leave the clinical to our physician here in terms of what happens when you specialize too early. I think there's something else I want to emphasize that we haven't touched upon. We've been talking about organized team sports, but we also know that getting kids active and out there, even if they're not in teams, is important. And this tool could be used for kids who just want to go out and play on the playground. And so we didn't mention that, but I think that's critical. But I'll leave that clinical aspect to our physician.
Yeah. Should I go?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess one thing that kind of jumps out at me as I kind of looked at some of the additional data is that not all specialization is created equal. So there were some sports like tennis, for instance, where when they said they specialize in their primary sport and they're playing that sport 9 to 10 months a year. Whereas when you looked at the data on football, for instance, yeah, they specialized early there as well. I think it was 11. But they're only playing football 6 months a year. So they're doing something else. The rest, are they sitting on the internet, or are they going out and playing kick the can? I mean, who really knows? But they're both kind of lumped together now as specialized athletes. But the consequences for that decision is probably really different for the one population than the other. And I think talking about kind of where do you want to go with this in the future, a deeper dive into that part of it, I think might be very illustrative.
And Michelle, your daughter specialized in gymnastics, I believe at a young age. She accumulated, I know, a number of injuries. Tell us briefly her story and how the Healthy Sport Index might have been able to help her choose other activities.
Yeah, sure. So Anna, over the course between kind of 8th and 10th grade, the bone in her hip basically progressively collapsed. And So obviously that is a life-altering injury, and as she went through her surgeries and stuff, trying to kind of figure out how do you recapture a sense of normalcy and kind of get that part of her life back. And any family who's kind of gone through that, so much of the conversation is driven by sport and injury and sport and safety, and that's really a very unidimensional view of what the sport brought to Anna and what sport brought to our family. And a tool like this, I think, would have been really helpful for us in terms of expanding that conversation and maybe kind of encouraging her to kind of look beyond gymnastics. But what else am I getting out of that sport? And where else might I be able to find it? And what wasn't brought up is another part of the information on the index isn't just complementary sports, but complementary activities, like you said. So it doesn't have to be an either or, but what else can you do that would add to your participation and attainment of goals in the sport that you love? So you don't have to necessarily give something up, but adding something else in can be very helpful.
Great. Well, let's go to some questions. We're near the end of the session. You can go to slido.com, go to 7th floor, and hashtag Project Play. And do we have any questions?
Yes. And here they are. The first question is, how does this data and its accessibility to parents impact the child's ability to choose the best sport for them as we think about ask kids what they want?
That's a good question.
Anyone want to try that? Michelle?
Yeah, I'd love to. So if you haven't already gone on the site, it's visually really appealing and kind of fun. And so as I've had people around me kind of look at it and into it, they've all kind of brought their kids on board. And and the kids themselves have been interested in kind of going through this. So I think just the design, that kind of cool little dial, you can play with the numbers, I think really encourages the kids to engage with the tool directly, not just through a parent.
Any other questions?
The next question is, how can a sport strive to have improved metrics? Is that the goal?
Yeah, I'll handle that one. That certainly is an objective. Our hope is that there will be, a Healthy Sport Index 2.0 in the future. We can update the data, but we really do hope that national sport organizations, sports as a whole, use this as a change agent, and that they're able to strategize and think about best practices. And we want to continue to have that conversation throughout Healthy Sport Index about driving best practices. One sport, a national sport organization we've talked to, won't identify them, finished a little bit lower in the results, and their reaction right away was, yeah, we're already starting to plan and strategize about how to improve our metrics and how to improve our data. And that's the exact reaction that we want.
Yeah, I think to add to that, John, one of the things that we talk about often is that sport in and of itself is neither positive or negative, and I think that the index can really highlight that there's always an opportunity for improvement, and even not just from sport to sport, but from season to season and from coach to coach. A football program can create amazing outcomes for their athletes, or it can be very detrimental to their athletes, and so much of that depends on the culture and the environment in which that sport is delivered, and the training of the coach, and the investment in time and support from parents and so forth. So the metrics should always be evaluated, I think, and always be looking for ways to improve. Like Kobe said earlier, we need to keep learning all the time, keep evaluating what we're doing, and did it achieve our goals, for that particular sport, right?
Last question I want to ask for this group, because I'm really curious on your answers, is right now there's a very limited amount of health data that's out there for youth sports, for high school sports. In a perfect world, what's your dream next research that could be done for children's health in sports? Michael, you want to start?
Sure, I'll kick it off. One of the things that we'd hoped to include in the index initially was, in addition to the physical activity data and the other measures, was looking at the actual sport skills that were developed in each sport. So if you took swimming, what are the sports skills or the physical literacy skills that are associated with that sport? And then from the perspective, and Michelle talked about it earlier, what would be complementary activities to offset maybe some of the overuse injuries that go along with that sport, and also create an opportunity for more lifelong participation. I think if you surveyed 50 swimmers that swam competitively year-round, 5 years after they finished swimming, how many of them have gone back into the pool? Very few. But they want to go into other sports and maybe lack the physical literacy skills to do those sports because they weren't given the opportunity early on to develop those skills, like tennis or golf or pickleball.
Laura, do you have a dream research project?
Many. But I think I would address the index itself. This is the beginning, and we're only going to know how valuable it is by people going on and using it. So first and foremost, encourage all of you to share it. And then look at that response and really see how we can aggregate data in a way, whether it's physical activity, psychosocial activity, again, to really make this a priority, whether it's moving towards coach certification or other types of things that really need to happen at that high level, because that's the only way, when we bring all that data together, show that it makes a difference, that I think we can change and make some kind of change that will affect kids long-term in the future.
Excellent. Michelle?
I think the psychosocial is ripe for further investigation. And in particular, why is it that one team has such positive psychosocial outcomes and others not so much? And so, is there something intrinsic to the sport itself? Is it something that is kind of part of the culture of the coaches who've kind of come up through that sport? What is the nidus of those differences in terms of psychosocial outcomes between some sports that really, on the surface, would seem to be very similar?
Great. We really appreciate the conversation. Thank you all so much. As a reminder, there's a press release on Healthy Sport Index in your packet. The website is healthysportindex.com. We hope you go there and share it and promote it. Our next strategy session here now on the 7th floor will be Emphasize Prevention, What Next for the U.S. Olympic Movement. And on the 8th floor, we will have Fast Break Ideas. This is a new session this year inspired by an international format known as Pechakucha. Or if you want to keep this conversation going about Healthy Sport Index, myself and the other panelists will be in a 7th floor room here outside, and feel free to join us. Thank you very much.
Great.